Hi guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer from Denmark who specializes in science fiction and fantasy stories. Tonight I'm here to read a chapter from Mandigo and the Hellhounds, which is a fantasy story of mine. If you want to know more about my stories and my writing, please feel welcome to follow the links on the Twitch. Chapter 10 from Mandigo and the Hellhounds. Squeezing his little duffel bag against his chest and with his blanket wrapped around his shoulders as a moderate shield against the storm, Mandigo stepped out into the yard in front of the mill together with his mother and father. His siblings hid behind the door frame and looked at the scene outside, their eyes wide and fearful. Carl was the only one who had the courage not to hide. However, he remained standing behind the doorstep. Mandigo's attention was first and foremost caught by the dogs. They were the biggest and wildest beasts he had ever seen. They lumbered back and forth in front of and beside him as they softly growled and bared their teeth. They were all black, and their eyes were blood red, and glowed unnaturally in the dark. Mandigo counted 12 dogs in all, and each and every one of them filled him with terror. At that moment, he wished that the wolf Magdan would show up. He had not seen the big wolf since the day he had found Bellatrix, but he had the feeling that he had been secretly following Mandigo on his trip to and from Greta's. But Magdan did not appear, and the big dogs formed a ring around Mandigo and his parents. That was when Mandigo noticed the knight. He was sitting on a big, long-limbed black steed whose eyes shone red, just like the dogs. He wore armor on his legs and feet and a thick black cape with a hood on his upper body. When Mandigo looked up, the knight drew back his hood, revealing a broad, harsh and gnarled face with black hair and a full beard. Mandigo had actually expected that his eyes would shine red as well, but luckily they had a human quality to them, even though they were grey and hard like polished steel and also extremely intense. "I'm Mortero," the knight said, "and from now on I will be your lord and master." He reached inside his cape and drew out a leather purse and threw it towards the miller, who caught it in midair. Mandigo heard the sound of jingling coins, and he had a sickening feeling. "Come, you'll be off now," Mortero said, as he lowered his armored fist down to Mandigo. "Mandigo!" Mandigo's mother suddenly cried out. She knelt down before him and gave him a big hug, the first and only one, as far as Mandigo could remember, that he ever received from her. Then he let go of him and stepped away. Mandigo stood for a moment, confused, uncertain, in the middle of the courtyard, and felt like the loneliest boy in the world. But then Mortero's fingers swooped down and dug into Mandigo's neck like the claws of a bird of prey and pulled him out without any difficulty up onto the horse, that immediately broke into a gallop. They rode night and day, holding only a few brief breaks. Mortero's horse galloped at a wild pace, tearing us along with an endurance beyond comparison, and the dogs were there constantly. They followed Mortero and Mandigo like fierce shadows. Every once in a while one of them would disappear out into the landscape and go hunting. Whenever that happened, Mortero would slow down the pace. When the dogs were finished hunting, they would return, and the wild pace would resume. Mandigo clutched onto the saddle. He had never tried riding such a horse before. Its long, stiff mane whipped his face, and his pounding his hooves in sparks in every time they rode across stone pavement. The landscape raced by them in a haze, and Mandigo would doze off quite often. The first few days, Mandigo hardly dared say anything to the Mortero, and the dark knight was just as silent towards him. He held Mandigo firmly and securely when they rode, but otherwise took surprisingly little notice of him. During one of their few breaks, Mandigo asked Mortero where they were going, but Mortero merely replied that they were on their way to his fortress. They lit a bonfire whenever they stopped, but they never stayed long enough for them to really get warm. Mandigo, who was only wearing his old clothes and a blanket, found it difficult to stay warm and keep dry whenever they ran into the rain shower. He froze a lot, and so much that his teeth chattered, but aside from giving him something to eat, Mortero didn't seem all that concerned about him. Mortero had some provisions in the form of ship's biscuits, a little salted pork, and some dried beans. They got water from the streams and brooks which they passed on their way. They would go through a village every now and then where Mandigo would smell freshly baked bread and fresh brewed meat, and his mouth would begin to water. But Matero never stopped. He continued riding like a madman. He surrounded himself with a sense of purpose that was both silent and firm, and which seemed to be just as hard and unyielding as the armor he wore. By looking at the sun's position during the day, Mandigo was able to determine that they were riding in a northeasterly direction, and as they rode he sensed how it grew continually more cold and harsh. The distance between the villages increased, and the wilderness grew denser. There was no longer any man-made path and routes, and Matero was therefore forced to slow down, which allowed Mandigo to collect his thoughts. He gazed down at the big, shaggy dogs that followed behind him and Matero. There was something about them that seemed wrong, just like there was with Matero's horse. They were bigger and tougher than they should have been. The way the iron shone was scary even in daylight, and the horse's pupils were vertical, like a cat's. After having built up some courage, Mandigo asked, "You are a wizard, aren't you?" "Yes, I am," Matero answered, from his position behind Mandigo. However, he did not expand on his answer. Mandigo thought a little bit again. Then he said, "The night you came to get me, you said that my father had taken me in. What did you mean by that?" "The miller and his wife are not your real parents, Mandigo. They are your foster parents. Your real parents died many years ago. I made an agreement with Sven the miller that he and his wife would take care of you and bring you up until your 12th winter, when I would come and get you to complete your training." "Training? For what?" "Only time will tell, Mandigo. Only time will tell." Mandigo thought for a moment again. He was partially in shock to hear that the people he had thought of as his parents for all those years actually weren't. But in a way it also explained a lot of things, as for example the fact that he had always felt estranged from his family and didn't seem to resemble any of his other siblings. "Who were my real parents?" he asked. "No one of significance," Matero answered. But Mandigo could sense that it was perhaps not entirely true. His sensitive ears had picked up on a faint tone in Matero's vocal cords that struck him as somehow wrong when he had answered him. At any rate, knowing exactly who his parents were was not insignificant to Mandigo. "I still would like to know who they were," he said. "I may tell you someday," Matero said, "if you promise to be an obedient and hard-working apprentice." "Would you at least tell me their names?" Mandigo asked. Rather than answering, Matero let Mandigo's question be swept away by the wind, only to disappear somewhere in the cold landscape. End of chapter 10.